The word has been with us for more than 2,000 years. Druid. Say it slowly and you can almost feel the weight of it. The ancient forests, the firelight, the silence of men who knew things that took a lifetime to learn. But here is the truth that most people never hear. Everything we know about the Druids, every single description, every ritual, every detail about their beliefs and their power came from their enemies. The Romans wrote about them. The Greeks wrote about them. And the Druids themselves wrote nothing. Not because they couldn't, but because they chose not to. That choice, that deliberate decision to keep everything inside the human mind rather than on a page, is one of the most remarkable things about this entire civilization. And it is where our story begins. Before we can understand who the Druids were, we have to understand the world they came from. Not the world of temples and marble columns and written laws, but a world of deep forest, sacred groves, and a kind of knowledge that was passed from one mind to another over 20 years of unbroken study. 20 years. Think about that for a moment. A young person who began their training as a druid in their early adolescence would not finish that training until they were well into their 30s. That is not a school. That is a life's work before the work even begins. And what they were learning during those 2 decades was not the content of any single subject. It was everything. The nature of the gods and the divine world. The movements of the stars and the planets, and what they meant for human affairs. The laws and customs of Celtic society, and how disputes should be resolved. The history and genealogy of the tribes, and their connections to the divine. The properties of plants and their uses in healing. The techniques of divination and how to read the signs that the natural world was constantly offering to anyone trained enough to see them. This was the curriculum. This was what a druid was expected to carry inside their mind. And none of it was written down. Now, to understand why that was not a limitation but a philosophical position, we need to go back even further. We need to go to the forests. Because the forests are where everything about the Druids begins. In the centuries before the birth of Christ, the forests of Western and Central Europe were not the fragmented patches of woodland we see today. They were vast. They were ancient. They were alive in ways that modern people can barely imagine. Because we have grown up in a world where the forest is the exception and the open landscape is the rule. In the Celtic world, it was the other way around. The forest was the world. And at the center of that forest world, dominant above all other trees in scale and longevity and sheer physical presence, was the oak. The oak was not chosen arbitrarily as the central symbol of druidical practice. It was chosen because in the mature forests of Europe, the oak was king. It grew the largest. It lived the longest. Individual oaks measured their age in centuries rather than decades. And their scale and permanence gave them a quality of sacred authority in a world where most living things were brief and fragile. The oak produced acorns that fed both humans and animals through the lean months of late winter. Its wood was the strongest and most durable available for building and burning. Its bark contained compounds with genuine medicinal value. And on rare occasions, a plant called mistletoe would take root in the high branches of an oak. Mistletoe was not unusual in the hedgerows and orchards of northern Europe. But on an oak, it was genuinely rare. And that rarity made it something extraordinary. A plant that had chosen the most sacred tree as its host. A gift in the druidical understanding of the divine world itself. The harvesting of that mistletoe would become one of the signature ritual acts of the druidical tradition. But we will come to that. First, we need to understand the space in which the Druids worked. Because the Druids did not build temples. They did not raise the monuments that the Mediterranean civilizations used to house their gods and mark their sacred places. Their sacred space was not constructed at all. It was recognized, found in the living world rather than imposed upon it. The Celts called it the Nemeton. In the Celtic languages, that word referred to the sacred grove, a clearing in the forest, a stand of ancient oaks, a place where the trees opened to let in the sky. And the remarkable thing about the word Nemeton is where it appears in the historical record. Not just in Gaul, not just in Britain. It appears in place names across the entire Celtic world, from Ireland in the far west to the Celtic settlements in Anatolia and what is now Turkey in the far east. Druids, the sacred oak grove. A place in central Anatolia where the Council of the Galatians, a Celtic people who had migrated into Asia Minor in the 3rd century before Christ, held their assembly. The same word. The same concept, thousands of miles apart. This tells us something profound about how consistent the Druidical tradition was across the entire range of Celtic civilization. A Druid from Britain and a Druid from what is now Turkey would have recognized each other's practice. They would have shared enough common ground in knowledge, ritual, and institutional structure to participate in the same religious and intellectual community. That cultural consistency, maintained across enormous distances without written texts, and without any centralized political authority to enforce it, is itself a remarkable achievement. It means that the oral tradition was working. It means that the 20-year education was producing results that were recognizable and consistent across thousands of miles of diverse Celtic culture. Now, the word Druid itself. Where does it come from? What does it actually mean? The most widely accepted explanation connects the first part of the word to the Proto-Celtic root for oak. The same root that survives in the Greek word dries, meaning tree, and in the Latin duris, meaning hard or enduring. The same root, much transformed, that sits inside the English word tree itself. The second part of the word connects to a root meaning to know or to see deeply. So a Druid, on this reading, is one who knows the oak. Or perhaps, one who sees deeply. Both meanings are important. One points to the natural setting of Druidical practice, the groves, the living forest, the oak that stood at the center of the Celtic sacred world. The other points to the claim that defined the Druid's social role. Not just knowledge in the ordinary sense, but a particular kind of seeing. A penetrating vision that could read the signs of the natural world, interpret the intentions of the divine, and understand the deep patterns beneath the surface of events. This was what the community recognized when it acknowledged someone as a Druid. Not simply a learned person, but someone who could see what others could not. The question of when the Druidical order first emerged is one that scholars have wrestled with for generations. And the honest answer is that we do not know precisely. The Druids themselves left no founding documents, no origin stories in written form, no institutional records that might tell us when the order first took shape as a recognizable social institution. What the evidence suggests is that the Druidic order as we can recognize it developed during the first millennium before Christ. Probably in the context of the Hallstatt culture, the first great flowering of Celtic civilization in Central Europe, and then spreading with the Latin cultural expansion that carried Celtic languages and practices across the European continent. By the time Celtic civilization reached its greatest geographic extent, which would have been roughly in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, the Druidic order was already well established. It had clear internal structure. It had recognized social functions. And it was already old enough to have accumulated the vast body of knowledge that it maintained through oral transmission. What is striking about the Druidical order at this point in its history is how complete and how sophisticated it already appears in our earliest descriptions of it. When the Greek geographer and philosopher Posidonius traveled through the Celtic world in the early 1st century before Christ and recorded what he observed and heard, he was not describing an institution in its early stages. He was describing something that had clearly been functioning for a long time, something with deep roots, something whose practices and beliefs were so thoroughly established that they had their own internal logic and their own self-reinforcing traditions. Now, the forests in which the Druids worked were not simply a backdrop to their activities. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Druidical worldview. The forest was not a setting. It was the teacher. The Celtic understanding of the natural world was a philosophy, a genuine philosophical position about the nature of reality and how human beings could come to know it. And that philosophy held that the natural world was not a collection of inert objects and mechanical processes. It was a community of living forces, each with its own spiritual character, all participating together in patterns of cyclical change, patterns that a trained observer could learn to read. The oak that had been growing for 3 centuries had something to teach about time and endurance. The spring that emerged from the earth at the same place generation after generation had something to say about the hidden waters that ran beneath the surface of the visible world. The behavior of birds in the days before a storm encoded information about coming change that the skilled observer could decode. None of this was mysticism in the sense of withdrawing from the real world into a purely interior experience. This was a claim about the world itself, about what the world contained and how it could be known. And the epistemological foundation of this claim was the idea that genuine knowledge of certain subjects, the behavior of the natural world, the movements of seasons and weather, the signs by which divine intention could be read in natural events, could only be acquired through sustained attentive presence in the environment where those subjects manifested. This is why the 20-year education required being in the forest, not in a library, not in a building constructed for the purpose of teaching, but in the living world itself. A Druid in training was not memorizing abstract propositions about nature. They were learning to read a living text. The forest, the sky, the water, the behavior of animals, the growth of plants. And alongside that direct learning from the natural world, they were receiving the oral transmission of thousands of years of accumulated human understanding of what that text meant. Now, when Julius Caesar wrote about the Druids in his account of the Gallic Wars, the narrative he produced as he was conquering Gaul for Rome in the 50s before Christ, one detail above all others struck him as worthy of special mention: the length of Druidical education. Caesar was a sophisticated man. He had been educated in the best traditions of Roman intellectual life. He understood what serious learning looked like, and even he found 20 years remarkable. He reports that Druids in training might spend 20 years memorizing the vast body of knowledge that constituted Druidical learning, and that all of this memorization was done through oral repetition rather than written text. But here is the thing that Caesar also noted, and that most people who discuss the Druids overlook. He specifically reports that the Druids were not ignorant of writing. They used the Greek alphabet for practical purposes in their communities: commercial records, personal letters, ordinary administrative matters. The choice to keep sacred knowledge oral was not forced upon them by ignorance. It was a deliberate philosophical position, and the reasoning behind it reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between knowledge, memory, and genuine understanding. Writing, the Druids argued, creates the illusion of knowledge. A person who has read something in a text believes they know it, but they have not done the work of truly internalizing it that sustained memorization requires. The knowledge that lives in the memory, that has been repeated until it is as natural as breathing, is knowledge that has been genuinely possessed. The knowledge that lives in a text is merely stored, available to be retrieved, but not truly integrated into the knower's understanding. There is a parallel here with certain traditions of Greek philosophy, particularly the Socratic tradition's suspicion of writing that Plato records in the Phaedrus. Socrates, as Plato presents him, worried that writing would cause people to rely on external marks rather than on genuine memory, that it would produce the appearance of wisdom without the substance. The Druids reached the same conclusion, and they acted on it more consistently than any ancient philosophical tradition we know of. They committed to oral transmission absolutely, and they built an educational system capable of maintaining that commitment across centuries and across the full geographic range of Celtic civilization. There is also a practical element to the choice, and this practical element was not an afterthought. It was understood from the beginning. Knowledge that exists only in the memories of trained individuals cannot be seized, stolen, or read by an enemy. The Roman armies that would eventually conquer Gaul could burn Celtic settlements. They could confiscate Celtic property. They could kill Celtic warriors. But they could not raid the memory of a Druid who had spent 20 years learning to remember. The oral tradition was the ultimate encrypted archive, secure in a way that no written text could ever be. Precisely because accessing it required years of dedicated personal commitment that no conqueror could force or shortcut. This was wisdom, not primitive limitation. It was a sophisticated understanding of vulnerability and resilience in a world where conquest was always a possibility. Now, the internal structure of the Druidical order was not flat or undifferentiated. It was hierarchical, and within that hierarchy, there were clear divisions between different grades of specialists, each with their own area of focus and their own distinct social functions. The most commonly described division, the one that appears in multiple ancient sources, distinguishes three main classes. First, the Druids proper. These were the religious and philosophical specialists, the ones responsible for ritual, theology, the interpretation of divine intention, and the resolution of legal and political disputes. When someone in the ancient world referred to a Druid without further specification, they usually meant this class. Second, the Vates, sometimes called the Ovates. These were the specialists in divination, sacrifice, and the interpretation of natural signs. Where the Druids proper were focused on the broad theological and legal framework of Celtic civilization, the Vates were the practitioners of the more immediate, more technique-focused work of reading the signs that the divine world offered in the behavior of animals, the patterns of weather, and the examination of sacrificial remains. Third, the bards. The poets and musicians whose responsibility was the preservation and transmission of history, genealogy, and the community's collective memory through the medium of composed and memorized verse. The bards were the closest thing the Celtic world had to a public intellectual class. Their work was performed. It was heard. It reached audiences that the more esoteric druidical learning never touched. And it shaped the self-understanding of Celtic communities in ways that were both artistically powerful and politically significant. These three classes were distinct in their roles, but they were not separate institutions. They were aspects of a single unified intellectual tradition. A student who entered the druidical order might move between these roles, or might specialize in one, depending on aptitude and circumstance. And the Druids proper, the highest rank, were expected to have comprehensive knowledge of what all three classes knew, even if their primary function was the theological and judicial work of the upper tier. Now, the social authority of the Druids proper, the highest rank of the order, was something that the Romans found genuinely remarkable, and slightly baffling, because it was a kind of authority they did not have a precise category for. The Roman world understood authority in terms of military power, political office, and legal right. The Druids' authority was none of these things. Caesar describes them as occupying a position of honor superior to the warrior nobility. They were exempt from military service. They paid no taxes. They could move freely between warring tribes without being subject to the violence that the absence of their protection would have brought upon any other traveler. A warrior who killed a traveling druid was not a man who had killed an enemy. He was a man who had committed sacrilege against the entire order of the divine world. And the consequences of that were understood to be catastrophic in ways that went far beyond any human punishment. Their authority derived entirely from the recognition of their learning and their role as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. In a society where the divine was understood as constantly present, constantly capable of intervening in human affairs, the specialists who could communicate with that presence and interpret its intentions were indispensable in a way that military power alone could never be. A great warrior could protect a community from human enemies, but only a druid could protect it from the displeasure of the gods. And in the Celtic worldview, the displeasure of the gods was the greater threat. The druid who achieved the highest levels of the order's learning was a figure of intellectual breadth that is almost difficult to comprehend in modern terms. Because we live in a world of specialization, a world where the doctor is not also the lawyer, and the lawyer is not also the astronomer, and the astronomer is not also the theologian. The druid was all of these things simultaneously, and not as a superficial generalist with thin knowledge of each subject, but as a deep specialist in every one of these domains, because 20 years of unbroken study, conducted under the guidance of masters who had themselves spent 20 years learning, was enough time to go very deep indeed. The nature of the gods and the divine world, the movements of the stars and planets and their significance, the nature of the physical world and the principles governing it, the history and genealogy of the Celtic tribes and their connections to the divine, the laws and customs of Celtic society and the principles of dispute resolution, the properties of plants and their medicinal applications, the techniques of divination and the interpretation of natural signs. Each of these subjects was a lifelong field of study in its own right. The fact that the druidical curriculum encompassed all of them and maintained consistent standards across that entire range through oral transmission alone was an intellectual achievement that deserves to be recognized as one of the great accomplishments of ancient civilization. Not just Celtic civilization, ancient civilization, full stop. And now we come to the belief that ancient observers found most remarkable about the Druids. The teaching that drew the attention of philosophers from Rome to Greece. The doctrine that had practical consequences for how Celtic warriors fought and died on the battlefield. The Druids taught that the soul does not die with the body, that at death, the soul passes into another body and is born again into a new life. This was not a vague, comforting idea about spiritual survival in some misty afterworld. It was a specific philosophical position about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical body. Pythagoras himself had taught the transmigration of souls, the idea that individual consciousness was not extinguished by death, but continued its journey through successive lives. And whether that parallel represented actual historical influence, whether Pythagorean ideas had reached the Celtic world through the Greek colonies of southern Gaul, or whether it represented parallel, independent development of a similar philosophical insight, the ancient observers found it significant enough to record. The consequences of this belief for Celtic attitudes toward death and warfare were enormous, and they were noted repeatedly by ancient writers. The Celts, they reported, faced death in battle with a courage that bordered on recklessness, not because they were incapable of fear, but because they did not regard death as the termination of their existence. If the soul passed at death into another body, and if the next life preserved some continuity with the choices made in this one, if courage was rewarded and cowardice punished in the distribution of rebirths, then dying bravely in battle was not a catastrophe. It was a transition, possibly even an advancement. A warrior who held this belief held it not as an abstract philosophical proposition, but as a living conviction that shaped his behavior on the battlefield, was a different kind of opponent than a warrior who believed that this life was the only one he would ever have. The Romans understood this. And when they set about suppressing the Druids, they understood that eliminating the Druidical teaching about the soul's immortality was part of the work of breaking Celtic military resistance. You cannot easily make a man fear death if he genuinely believes that death is not the end. But you can silence the teachers who transmitted that belief. And that is what Rome eventually did. Now, the ritual life that the Druids oversaw was not a random collection of ceremonies. It was organized around a coherent framework, a calendar that divided the year into sacred time and ordinary time, that marked the moments when the boundary between the human world and the divine world was particularly permeable, and that structured the community's relationship with the natural forces that governed its survival. The Celtic year was divided by 4 great festivals. For moments of transition when the turning of the year created special conditions for contact with the divine. Samhain, at the beginning of what we now call November. Imbolc, at the beginning of February. Beltane, at the beginning of May. And Lugnasad, at the beginning of August. These were not merely agricultural markers, though they corresponded to significant moments in the agricultural cycle. They were sacred occasions. Moments when the veil between worlds was thin, when the presence of divine powers was particularly intense, and the possibility of communication between the human world and the supernatural world was at its greatest. Samhain was the most sacred and the most spiritually charged of the 4. It marked the beginning of the dark half of the year, the moment when summer died and the long darkness began. In the Druidical understanding, it was the time when the ancestors could return to visit the living, when the spirits of the dead moved freely through the world, when the boundary between what is and what has been became briefly passable in both directions. The fires lit on Samhain were not merely celebratory. They were protective and purifying. They marked the boundary of the community and kept the dangerous supernatural forces of the dark half of the year at bay. The special foods prepared for Samhain were set out for ancestors who might return. The disguises that allowed humans to move among supernatural beings without being recognized were worn by those who had to be out after dark. The hospitality extended to unknown wanderers who might be returned ancestors was practiced as a matter of genuine obligation rather than mere custom. And every one of these practices survived, transformed, secularized, stripped of their original theological meaning, but structurally continuous with the ancient Druidical Samhain. They survived as Halloween. The costumes, the candles, the special food, the wandering strangers at the door. The ancient festival of the Druids reaching 2,500 years forward in time to the modern world. Among the ritual practices associated with the Druids, one description by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder has become perhaps the most iconic image we have of Druidical ceremony. Pliny describes a Druid in white robes climbing a sacred oak tree. At the top of the tree, growing from the ancient branches, is a clump of mistletoe. The Druid cuts it with a golden sickle. Below, on the ground, two white bulls are sacrificed simultaneously. The mistletoe falls into a white cloth held by attendants, and the ceremony is complete. The details of this description have been debated by scholars. Pliny was writing from secondary sources. He had his own rhetorical purposes, his own reasons for presenting the Druids in a particular way. But the core of the ceremony rings true with what other sources and what archaeology confirm about Druidical practice. The mistletoe on the oak was genuinely rare. Its rarity made it precious as a symbol, a sign of the oak's special sacred character, a gift that the divine world had placed specifically there, on the most sacred tree, as an indication of favor and presence. The white robes, if accurate, spoke to the purity required for sacred action. The golden sickle, which would actually be impractical for cutting woody material, may have been a symbolic implement rather than a functional tool. The white bulls were the most expensive and prestigious of sacrificial animals. The ceremony, whatever its precise form, was clearly one of the most important in the Druidical ritual calendar. And Pliny's description of it, for all its possible inaccuracies of detail, has become the image that more than any other has shaped the modern imagination's picture of the Druids. Now, there is a question about Druidical practice that cannot be avoided, because it looms large in the ancient sources, and because it has been used both to condemn the Druids and to justify their suppression. The question of human sacrifice. Caesar and other Roman writers described the Druids using large wicker structures in the shape of human beings, filled with living people, and set alight as a form of sacrifice. The accuracy of this description has been debated by scholars for generations. Some argue that it reflects genuine practice. Others argue that it is hostile propaganda, the kind of accusation that conquering powers routinely level against the peoples they are conquering in order to make conquest seem like a moral duty rather than what it actually is. The archaeological evidence introduces a middle path. Across the wetlands of northern Europe, from Denmark to England to Ireland, preserved human bodies have been recovered from the bogs. Bodies that the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions of the peat have preserved for 2,000 years with extraordinary completeness. The Talon man from Denmark, the Lindau man from England, the Cashel man from Ireland, and dozens of others. And what the examination of these bodies reveals is that many of them were killed in ways that speak to ritual purpose rather than simple execution. The Lindau man, for example, was struck on the head, strangled with a cord, and had his throat cut, apparently simultaneously. He had consumed what appears to have been a ritual meal of burned grain before his death. His hands were uncalloused, suggesting he had not done physical labor. His nails were manicured. He was, by the physical evidence of his body, a man of high status. Not a slave or a prisoner. Not someone who would have been casually killed. The care with which his death was carried out, the multiple methods of killing, the evidence of a ritual meal, the preservation of the body in the bog, all suggest that what happened to the Lindau man was not a crime. It was a ceremony. What precisely that ceremony was, what it meant, what necessity it was understood to address, we cannot know, because the people who performed it left no written account. The knowledge of why the bog bodies died went into the ground with them. And this, perhaps more than anything else, speaks to the loss that the destruction of the Druidical tradition represents. Not just the loss of practices that we might find troubling or that we might admire, but the loss of the entire framework of meaning within which those practices made sense. We have the bodies. We do not have the theology. We have the evidence of ceremony. We do not have the understanding. We are left looking at the physical remains of a civilization whose intellectual life is almost entirely lost to us. And that loss is one of the great tragedies of ancient history. Now, before we go further into what the Druids did and how their world was eventually destroyed, there is one persistent misconception that needs to be addressed directly, because it is one of the most widespread pieces of misinformation about the ancient world: the association between the Druids and Stonehenge. Stonehenge, the great prehistoric monument on Salisbury Plain in southern England. Those massive stones, some of them weighing more than 40 tons, arranged in circles and alignments that track the movements of the sun and moon with astonishing precision. For at least 3 centuries, since the antiquarian John Aubrey first suggested the connection in the 17th century, Stonehenge has been associated in popular imagination with the Druids. And that association is wrong. In the sense that matters most, which is chronology, it is simply incorrect. Stonehenge was built approximately 2,000 years before any recognizable Druidical practice existed. It belongs to the Neolithic and early Bronze Age periods, roughly 3,000 to 1,500 years before Christ. Celtic cultures, and with them the Druidical tradition, did not develop until the first millennium before Christ. There is a gap of more than 1,000 years between the builders of Stonehenge and the earliest Druids. The builders of Stonehenge spoke a language we cannot identify. They were not Celts. They were not the ancestors of the Druids in any direct cultural sense. They were the inhabitants of an earlier world whose precise beliefs and practices are entirely lost to us. But, and this is an important but, the Druids certainly knew about Stonehenge, and they almost certainly used it. The ancient sacred sites of the British landscape, the great stone circles, the long barrows, the hill forts, the springs and sacred pools, had been places of religious significance for millennia before the first Druid walked among them. And the Druids, who understood the landscape itself as a sacred text, who believed that certain places had a concentrated sacred quality that made them especially suitable for contact with the divine, would have recognized Stonehenge as exactly the kind of site they were looking for. It had been sacred for so long that the sacredness was built into the place itself. The stones still tracked the sun at the solstice. The astronomical alignment still worked. And the Druidical astronomical knowledge, which we will examine in detail, was continuous with exactly the kind of sky watching that Stonehenge was built to facilitate. So the truth about Stonehenge and the Druids is more interesting than the simple popular version. The Druids did not build it, but they may well have stood within those stone circles on midsummer mornings and watched the sun rise exactly where the ancient builders had predicted it would. And in doing so, they were participating in a continuity of sacred observation that stretched back more than 2,000 years before their own time. That is not a connection to dismiss. That is one of the oldest threads in human history. Now, of all the evidence we have for Druidical knowledge, one of the most extraordinary pieces is a physical object. A broken bronze tablet found in 1897 near the town of Coligny in eastern France. The tablet is now known as the Coligny calendar. And it is, in a very real sense, the Druids speaking to us directly. Not through the words of Caesar or Strabo or Tacitus or Pliny. Not through the filter of Roman hostility or Greek admiration or any other external perspective, but through their own knowledge, their own intellectual work, preserved in metal. The Coligny calendar is a lunisolar calendar of considerable sophistication. A system that coordinates the cycles of the moon and the cycles of the sun into a single coherent framework that allows the accurate prediction of the seasons, the festivals, and the astronomical events that were of religious and practical importance to Celtic communities. Now, the challenge of creating a lunisolar calendar is not trivial. The solar year, the time it takes the Earth to complete one orbit around the sun, is approximately 365.25 days. The lunar month, the time from one new moon to the next, is approximately 29.5 days. These two cycles do not divide evenly into each other. 12 lunar months gives you roughly 354 days, about 11 days short of a solar year. 13 lunar months gives you roughly 383 days, about 18 days too long. To reconcile these two incommensurable cycles into a single calendar that stays accurate over time requires sophisticated mathematical reasoning and careful long-term observation. The Coligny calendar solves this problem with a 5-year cycle of 62 lunar months, which allows the lunar and solar years to be kept in rough alignment through the systematic insertion of additional months at calculated intervals. This is the same general approach used by the Babylonian calendar, by the Hebrew calendar, and by the Greek Metonic cycle. It is a solution that requires not just observation, but calculation. Not just recording what you see, but understanding the mathematics that lies beneath the visible patterns. The Coligny calendar demonstrates, in physical form, that the Druidical claim to expertise in astronomy was not mystification. It was not simply a way of impressing people who didn't know any better. It reflected genuine computational skill of a high order. And it suggests that the astronomical knowledge preserved in the Druidical oral tradition was sophisticated enough to produce and maintain a calendar that that tracked two independent cosmic cycles simultaneously across multiple years. This is the knowledge of people who were paying very close attention to the sky for a very long time. So as we come to the end of this first part of the Druid story, let us hold in mind what we have established. The Druids were not the mysterious robed figures of romantic fantasy. They were not primitive shamans fumbling in the dark of prehistory. A civilization that chose to preserve its knowledge through memory rather than text, through living minds rather than dead pages. A civilization whose sacred spaces were forests rather than temples, whose sacred text was the natural world itself, whose calendar tracked the movements of the moon and the sun with mathematical precision. A civilization that spread its consistent intellectual tradition across thousands of miles of diverse landscape without any coercive central authority, held together by nothing more than the power of 20 years of shared learning and the mutual recognition of what that learning meant. This was the world the Druids built. And in the next part of this story, we will follow that world as it collided with the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever produced. We will follow it into war, into suppression, into the desperate, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to preserve against Roman conquest what 20 years of unbroken study had taken a lifetime to create. The forests are still out there. The ancient oaks are still standing. But the men who knew what they meant are gone. And how they disappeared is a story that needs to be told in full. We left the Druids standing in their sacred groves, masters of a tradition that had taken centuries to build and that required 20 years of unbroken study to enter. We left them with their lunisolar calendar, their oral archive of accumulated knowledge, their philosophy of the soul's immortality, and their unshakable position at the center of Celtic civilization. Now we follow them out of the groves and into the world. Because the Druids were not monks. They were not hermits who withdrew from society to contemplate the divine in solitude. They were deeply, practically, inextricably embedded in every aspect of Celtic life. And to understand how powerful they really were, and why Rome eventually decided that they had to be destroyed, we need to understand what they actually did for the communities that depended on them. Let us begin with the water. Across Britain, Ireland, Gaul, and the Celtic regions of Central Europe, there are springs. Some of them thermal, rising warm from deep underground. Some of them mineral-rich, carrying dissolved iron or sulfur or calcium or magnesium from the rocks through which they have traveled. Some of them simply ancient, emerging at the same spot from the same underground source for thousands of years with a constancy that in a world of change and uncertainty must have seemed like a message from the earth itself. These springs were sacred, and the archaeological record has documented their use as sites of druidical practice in extraordinary detail. Excavations at sacred springs and wells across the Celtic world have recovered quantities of votive offerings that stagger the imagination. Coins, jewelry, weapons, miniature implements made specifically for the purpose of offering, carved wooden figures, and occasionally, human remains. These offerings were not thrown into the water carelessly. They were placed there with intention, with ceremony, with the understanding that the water itself was a point of contact between the human world and the divine world beneath the surface. The spring was a wound in the skin of the earth through which the divine world bled upward into the human one. And the offerings placed in it were communications sent downward through that wound to the powers that lived below. The most famous of these sacred spring sites is Bath, in southwestern England. The Romans called it Aquae Sulis, the waters of Sulis. Sulis was the Celtic goddess of the spring, a deity associated with healing and with the liminal space between worlds that the thermal waters represented. When the Romans arrived and built their great bathing complex over the sacred spring, they did not simply erase the existing Celtic cult. They blended it with their own religious tradition. Sulis became Sulis Minerva, a fusion of the Celtic goddess with the Roman goddess of wisdom and healing. And the temple that rose over the spring served both traditions simultaneously, a physical monument to the way conquered cultures do not simply vanish but transform, blending with the culture of their conquerors in ways that preserve elements of the original even as they reshape it. But before the Romans came, before the temple was built, the spring at Bath was already ancient, already sacred, already a place where the Druids who understood the healing properties of mineral waters brought the sick and the suffering for treatment. And this brings us to something that modern discussions of the Druids often overlook or dismiss: the medical knowledge of the Druidical order. Celtic medicine, as practiced by the Druids and by the specialist healers associated with them, was not the primitive fumbling of credulous savages. It was a sophisticated combination of plant-based pharmacology, ritual practice, and the therapeutic use of sacred sites that had been accumulated through centuries of empirical observation. The Celtic Materia Medica, the catalog of plants and their medical applications, was extensive. We know this because the Roman natural historians who encountered Celtic medicine were impressed by it. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian, whose encyclopedic natural history attempted to catalog everything known about the natural world, incorporated information about Celtic plant lore into his work. He did not do this because he was romantically attached to Celtic culture. He did it because he recognized, as a man who had spent his life studying the properties of natural substances, that Celtic practitioners knew things about plants that the Greco-Roman medical tradition had not documented. The healing properties attributed to sacred springs were not purely magical either. Many of the springs associated with Druidical practice have genuinely unusual mineral content. Iron-rich waters can have real effects on anemia and related conditions. Sulfur-rich waters have documented therapeutic effects on skin conditions, joint pain, and respiratory problems. Calcium and magnesium in solution can have genuine effects on bone and muscle complaints. The Druids who prescribed treatments at these springs may not have understood the chemistry, but they did not need to understand the chemistry to observe the results. Generations of watching which conditions responded well to which waters produced a body of empirical knowledge that was genuinely useful. A person with a skin condition who bathed in sulfur-rich water and got better was not experiencing a miracle. They were experiencing the benefits of a treatment that had been discovered through centuries of trial and observation. The Druid who prescribed that treatment was practicing medicine, not in the modern sense, with controlled trials and biochemical understanding, but in the practical sense of applying accumulated knowledge to individual cases with the expectation of specific therapeutic outcomes. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Druidical medicine. The distinction that we would make between medical treatment and spiritual treatment was not meaningful in the Druidical worldview. Illness was not understood as a purely physical malfunction. It was understood as a disruption of the relationship between the individual and the larger world, the natural world, the divine world, and the social world. A person who was sick was not simply a body with something wrong with it. They were a being whose connections to the forces that sustained life had been damaged or disordered. And treatment involved restoring those connections through both physical means, the application of medicinal plants, the use of therapeutic waters, the manipulation of the body, and spiritual means, the performance of rituals, the invocation of divine healing, the identification and correction of whatever spiritual imbalance had allowed the illness to take hold. This integrated approach to healing is not as distant from modern understanding as it might seem. The recognition that psychological state affects physical health, that social isolation and spiritual distress can make physical illness worse, that the patient's belief in the treatment affects its outcome. These are ideas that modern medicine has gradually re-acknowledged after centuries of pretending that the body and the mind were separate machines. The Druids never made that separation in the first place. Now, the medical function of the Druids was one aspect of their practical indispensability to Celtic communities, but it was not the only one, and perhaps not even the most important one. Because in a world without written law, without courthouses, without professional lawyers in any sense that a Roman or a modern person would recognize, the Druids served as the legal system itself. The Druidical judge, known in the later Irish tradition as the Brehon, occupied a social position of extraordinary importance. Celtic law was not written down. It was maintained in the memory of trained specialists who had spent years, sometimes decades, learning the vast oral tradition of legal precedent and custom that governed every aspect of Celtic social life. And when we say every aspect, that is not an exaggeration. The rules of inheritance, the laws of marriage, the obligations of hospitality, the protocols of warfare, the terms under which treaties could be made and broken, the procedures for resolving disputes over land, over livestock, over honor, over insult, the compensation owed for injuries, calibrated by the severity of the injury and the social status of the injured party. The rights and obligations of kings, of warriors, of craftsmen, of women, of children, of the elderly. All of this was carried in the mind of the Druidical judge, and the ability to recall and apply these precedents correctly, to listen to the competing claims of disputants, to weigh the evidence, and to deliver a judgment that was both legally sound and accepted by the community as legitimate. This was the core of judicial Druidical practice. But the Druidical judge had something that no modern judge possesses, something that made their authority qualitatively different from any legal authority we know. They had the power of spiritual excommunication, the ability to exclude a person from religious ceremonies and, by extension, from the social fabric of the community. This was the Druids' ultimate judicial instrument, and the ancient sources describe it as more feared than physical punishment, more feared than imprisonment, more feared, even, than death. Because a person who was excluded from Celtic religious life was effectively excluded from social life itself. They could not participate in the feasts that bound the community together. They could not attend the assemblies where collective decisions were made. They could not take part in the ceremonies that marked the great transitions of life: birth, coming of age, marriage, death. Other community members were expected to avoid contact with them. To speak with them was to risk contamination by the spiritual pollution that excommunication implied. To trade with them was to share in their disgrace. To offer them hospitality was to invite the displeasure of the divine world into your own home. In a culture where community membership was the foundation of meaningful existence, where a person's identity was defined not as an individual in the modern sense, but as a member of a web of relationships, family, clan, tribe, people, this social death was experienced as genuinely terrible. It was not a metaphor for suffering. It was suffering, the most complete isolation a human being could experience in the Celtic world. And the threat of its imposition was sufficient to bring most disputants into compliance with Druidical rulings. You did not need a police force to enforce the law. You needed the authority of someone who could cut you off from everything that made life worth living. This is why the Druids were more powerful than warriors. A warrior could kill you. A Druid could make you wish you were dead. And the community would enforce the sentence, not out of fear of the Druid, but out of genuine belief that the excommunicated person had become spiritually dangerous. That contact with them would bring harm. That they had been separated from the divine order for reasons that were both legally and spiritually sound. This system of justice, maintained without written codes, without professional advocates, without appeal courts in any modern sense, functioned effectively across the Celtic world for centuries. It was not primitive. It was sophisticated. It was a legal system built on the foundation of oral tradition, community consensus, and spiritual authority, and it worked. It resolved disputes. It maintained social order. It punished wrongdoing and compensated victims. And it did all of this through the memory and the judgment of individual Druids whose authority rested not on any appointment by a secular power, but on the recognition by their communities that they possessed the knowledge and the wisdom to be trusted with these decisions. Now, alongside the medical and the legal functions, the Druids served as the prophets and diviners of Celtic society. And this function, particularly as exercised by the specialist class known as the Vates or Ovates, was not what the modern word prophet might suggest. The Druidical diviner was not simply claiming supernatural insight. They were not standing on a hilltop announcing what the gods had whispered to them in a dream. They were applying a systematic body of interpretive knowledge to observable phenomena. They were watching, they were interpreting, and they were producing conclusions that, from within the Celtic worldview, were as rational and evidence-based as any other form of expert judgment. The techniques of divination were multiple. The observation of natural signs, the behavior of birds, which was also a central element of Roman augury, was read for its predictive content. Certain flight patterns indicated certain outcomes. Certain bird calls at certain times carried specific meaning. This was not random guessing. It was the application of a traditional system of interpretation that had been refined through centuries of observation. The examination of sacrificial remains, particularly the entrails of animals, was another technique. The condition, color, and configuration of the organs were read according to established interpretive conventions. A liver with certain features predicted one kind of outcome. A liver with different features predicted another. This practice, known as haruspicy, was shared with the Etruscan and Roman traditions, and its presence in Celtic divination suggests either cultural borrowing or independent development of the same basic idea, that the condition of a sacrificed animal's internal organs reflects the condition of the spiritual forces governing the situation about which the divination is being performed. Dreams and trances induced by specific techniques, including fasting, sleep deprivation, and possibly the ingestion of psychoactive plants, were also used for divinatory purposes. The dreamer who had been properly prepared and who dreamed in the right conditions under druidical supervision was understood to be receiving information from the divine world that was delivered through the medium of dream imagery. The Druid's role was to interpret that imagery, to decode it using the traditional interpretive framework, and to translate the raw material of the dream into actionable guidance. In the observation of astronomical phenomena, the movements of the stars and planets, the phases of the moon, the occurrence of eclipses and unusual celestial events, was read for its predictive significance. The observation that certain astronomical configurations reliably preceded certain natural or social events was genuine empirical knowledge. Not perfect knowledge. Not knowledge that would satisfy a modern astronomer's standards of evidence, but knowledge accumulated through centuries of systematic observation, embedded in a theoretical framework that gave it coherent interpretive structure. All of these divinatory techniques were not practiced in isolation. They were components of a unified system of reading the signs of the natural and divine worlds. And the Druid or Vates who practiced them was a specialist in that system. A person who had spent years learning not just the individual techniques, but the theoretical framework that connected them, the worldview that made sense of them, the understanding of how the divine world communicated with the human world through natural signs, and what it meant when those signs pointed in particular directions. Now, all of these functions, medical, legal, prophetic, religious, made the Druids indispensable to Celtic communities at every level of their social organization. A Celtic tribe without Druids was a tribe without its legal system, without its medical practitioners, without its historical memory, without its means of communicating with the divine forces on which all human well-being was understood to depend, without its calendar keepers, without its astronomers, without its counselors and advisors, without the people who could tell you whether a proposed military campaign would succeed or fail, whether a marriage would be blessed or cursed, whether a piece of land was suitable for settlement or tainted by some spiritual contamination that would bring disaster on anyone who built there. This practical indispensability was the foundation of Druidical social power, and it was more durable than any military or political authority, because it was continuously renewed. Every time a Druid resolved a dispute fairly, their authority grew. Every time a Druid's medical treatment healed a sick person, their necessity was confirmed. Every time a Druid's reading of the omens proved accurate, the system's credibility was reinforced. The Druidical order did not need to maintain its power through fear or through political manipulation. It maintained its power by being genuinely useful, by providing services that no one else could provide, and by doing so consistently enough that communities regarded their Druids not as luxuries or as relics of a superstitious past, but as essential infrastructure, as necessary to the functioning of the tribe as warriors or farmers. This is what made them so dangerous to Rome. Not their mystical powers, not their supposed human sacrifices, not the curses they pronounced on the battlefield, although those had their effects too. What made them dangerous was that they held Celtic civilization together. They were the glue. They were the network. They were the people who connected tribe to tribe, who maintained common standards of law and practice across the Celtic world, who carried the memory that gave Celtic communities their sense of identity and continuity. Destroy the Druids, and you destroyed the organizing principle of Celtic resistance. Leave the Druids in place, and every military victory was temporary, because the Druids would remember the defeat, interpret it within their framework, find meaning in it, and mobilize the community's spiritual resources for the next round of resistance. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we reach the Roman suppression, we need to understand the institution that more than any other demonstrates the political reach and organizational sophistication of the Druidical order. The Great Annual Assembly. Caesar describes it in his account of the Gallic Wars. And what he describes is one of the most remarkable political institutions of the ancient world. Once a year, Druids from all parts of Gaul gathered in the territory of the Carnutes. The Carnutes were a Gaulish tribe of the central Loire region. Their territory occupied what the Gauls themselves understood as the geographic center of Gaul, the symbolic heart of the Gaulish world. And in the sacred groves of that territory, on ground that had been hallowed by long tradition and divine presence, the Druids of all Gaul assembled. Think about what that means. In a world without roads in the Roman sense, without postal services, without any of the infrastructure that the Romans used to maintain communication across their empire, representatives from every Gaulish tribe made the journey to this annual assembly. They came from the coasts of Brittany in the far west, from the forests of the Ardennes in the northeast, from the valleys of the Rhone in the southeast, from the foothills of the Pyrenees in the south. They traveled through territories that might be hostile, through lands belonging to tribes with which their own tribe might be in active conflict. And they arrived safely, because the Druidical exemption from tribal violence protected them. A Druid traveling to the annual assembly could cross any boundary, pass through any territory, and arrive unmolested. Not because he was accompanied by warriors, not because he carried a diplomatic passport, but because every person in the Celtic world understood that to harm a Druid on the road was to invite catastrophe. Divine catastrophe. The kind of consequence that no warrior's shield could deflect. This annual gathering was not merely a religious ceremony. It was a functioning political institution. It served multiple practical purposes simultaneously. First, it was the court of final appeal. Disputes that had not been resolved at the local or tribal level were brought to the assembly for adjudication. Cases that required the collective authority of the assembled order, cases that involved intertribal disputes where no local Druid could claim neutrality, cases that raised questions of principle that individual Druids felt unable to resolve alone. All of these were heard at the annual assembly. The judgment of the assembled Druids was final. There was no higher authority to appeal to. And the threat of collective excommunication, the power of the assembled order to exclude not just an individual, but an entire tribe from the religious and therefore the social life of the Celtic world, ensured compliance. Second, the assembly was the occasion for the transmission and standardization of Druidical knowledge. This is a function that is easy to overlook, but that was absolutely critical to the maintenance of the Druidical tradition. In a system based entirely on oral transmission, the risk of drift was real. Over time, without some mechanism for checking and correcting, the knowledge maintained by Druids in different regions would inevitably begin to diverge. Small errors would accumulate, local variations would develop, and the consistency of the tradition across the Celtic world would gradually erode. The annual assembly was the mechanism that prevented this. It was the moment when practitioners from different regions could compare their learning. When a Druid from Brittany could recite a genealogy or a legal precedent alongside a Druid from the Rhone Valley, and discrepancies could be identified and corrected. When the oral tradition could be checked against itself, the memories of many serving as a mutual verification system that no individual memory could provide. This is an extraordinary solution to the problem of maintaining a consistent intellectual tradition without writing. It is, in effect, a distributed error correction system. Each individual Druid is a node in a network. The annual assembly is the moment when the network synchronizes, and the result is a tradition that maintained remarkable consistency across the entire Celtic world for centuries, without a single written word. Third, the assembly was a political forum. The Druids were not isolated from political reality. They were deeply involved in it. They advised kings and chieftains. They interpreted the signs that indicated whether proposed military campaigns would succeed or fail. They mediated between warring tribes. And the annual assembly gave them the opportunity to assess the broader political and military situation facing Gaul as a whole. This was the one occasion in the year when representatives of all Gaulish tribes could meet in a context of sacred neutrality. When the rivalries and enmities that normally prevented intertribal communication could be set aside under the protection of divine sanction. When matters of common concern, threats from outside the Celtic world, questions of shared religious practice, the coordination of resistance against external enemies, could be discussed by the people best positioned to understand both the immediate facts and the deeper forces at work. The assembly was presided over by an archdruid, a single leader of the entire order, elected for life by his fellow druids. This archdruid was the closest thing the Celtic world had to a pan-ethnic religious leader. His authority was not based on military power, not on political appointment, not on birth or wealth, or any of the conventional sources of authority in the ancient world. It was based entirely on the recognition of his peers that he possessed the deepest knowledge and the soundest judgment among all the Druids of Gaul. He was chosen because the people best qualified to judge intellectual and spiritual excellence judged him to be the best among them. This is a meritocratic principle of leadership selection that is remarkable for any period of human history, and it was functioning in Celtic Gaul centuries before the Common Era. The election of the archdruid was not always smooth. Caesar describes at least one occasion when a disputed succession nearly led to armed conflict among the supporters of rival candidates. This is actually an important detail, because it demonstrates that the institution was a living political reality with genuine stakes, not a purely ceremonial arrangement that everyone went through the motions of observing. People cared who the archdruid was. Communities invested real political capital in supporting their candidate. The outcome mattered because the archdruid's judgments, his interpretations of law and custom, his readings of the signs, his decisions about which tribes were in compliance with sacred obligations and which were not, affected the real interests of real communities. The power of collective excommunication wielded by the assembled Druids was a political instrument of considerable force, and it was the archdruid who presided over its application. A tribe whose leadership was judged to have violated the sacred obligations of Celtic civilization could be collectively excluded. Its members denied the protection of sacred neutrality when they traveled. Its chieftain stripped of the divine sanction that legitimized his rule. Its people cut off from the ceremonies, the festivals, the assemblies that structured Celtic communal life. This was not a symbolic punishment. It was a devastation. A tribe under collective excommunication was a tribe that could not make binding treaties with other tribes, could not participate in the trade networks that depended on the trust generated by shared religious observance, could not marry its children into other communities with the divine blessing that made marriages legitimate, could not, in short, function as a member of Celtic civilization. The threat of this was usually sufficient. Most disputes were resolved long before collective excommunication became necessary. But the power existed, and its existence shaped political behavior across the entire range of Celtic civilization. Leaders who might otherwise have acted purely in their own interest knew that the assembled Druids were watching, that the standards of Celtic sacred law were being applied not just within individual tribes, but across the entire Gaulish world, that there was an authority above the authority of any individual king or chieftain, an authority grounded not in military force, but in the shared recognition of divine and intellectual legitimacy. This was the political world that Julius Caesar encountered when he marched into Gaul in 58 before Christ. And he understood it immediately. Caesar was many things: a brilliant military commander, a ruthless politician, a superb prose stylist who wrote his own propaganda with a literary skill that has rarely been equaled. But above all, Caesar was intelligent, and he recognized in the Druidical order the organizational center of the world he was trying to conquer. The relationship between the Druids and the political crisis that would lead to the destruction of Gaulish independence is one of the most consequential episodes in European history. And it began, as so many historical catastrophes begin, with a combination of internal division and external pressure. The Druids were aware of the Roman threat from an early stage. They had information networks that reached across the Celtic world. The Roman expansion in southern Gaul, which had been underway since the late 2nd century before Christ, was visible to any politically aware observer. The establishment of the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul, what the Romans called Provincia, which gives us the modern name province, had brought Roman power to the doorstep of independent Gaul. The trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world to the Celtic interior carried information along with goods. And the Druids, who traveled freely and who maintained connections with their counterparts across the Celtic world, were among the best informed observers of the changing political landscape. Whether the annual assembly played a direct role in organizing resistance to Rome, whether it served as the coordinating body for a pan-Gaulish response to the Roman threat, is a question that the surviving sources do not answer clearly. But what is clear is that Caesar identified the Druids as a significant element in the organization of Gaulish resistance, and that the suppression of the Druids was, from the very beginning, a deliberate strategic objective of Roman policy in Gaul. Now, the role of the Druids in Celtic warfare was not that of combatants. This is important to understand. The Druids were specifically exempt from military service. They did not carry weapons. They did not fight. The ancient sources are consistent in presenting them as non-fighting specialists who accompanied armies in advisory and ritual capacities. But their function in the context of warfare was nonetheless significant. And from the Celtic perspective, it was potentially decisive, because the Druids were the people who could read the omens. They were the ones who could tell whether a proposed battle would end in victory or defeat. They were the ones who could call down divine favor on Celtic forces, or divine punishment on their enemies. And their presence on the battlefield was understood to affect the spiritual balance of the conflict in ways that might matter as much as the physical disposition of troops and the quality of weapons and armor. The battle curse was one of the most dramatic expressions of Druidical power in a military context. A Druidical pronouncement of divine condemnation against an enemy force, conducted in full view of both armies, performed with the full theatrical weight of Druidical ceremonial practice. The Druid or Druids would stand before the assembled warriors. They would raise their hands. They would invoke the powers of the divine world, and they would pronounce the curse, a declaration that the divine forces of the natural world had been marshaled against the enemy, that the gods had withdrawn their protection from the opposing army, that the spiritual balance of the conflict had been tilted in favor of the Celtic forces. The effect of this was psychological as much as theological. A warrior who genuinely believed that the divine world had been invoked against him, that the sacred powers of earth and sky and water had been directed against his enterprise, was a warrior who might hesitate, who might flinch at a critical moment, who might interpret ordinary battlefield confusion as evidence that the curse was working. And in the brutal arithmetic of ancient hand-to-hand combat, where morale was often the decisive factor, that moment of hesitation could make the difference between victory and defeat. The Romans understood this. They understood the psychological dimension of Druidical battle ritual, and they knew that the most effective way to neutralize it was not to develop counter-rituals of their own, although Roman armies had their own religious specialists, but to eliminate the Druids themselves. Cut off the source of the belief, and the belief would eventually die. The role of Druids in interpreting omens before battles was a practical function that influenced military decision-making in concrete ways. Before any major military operation, the Druids who accompanied a Celtic army would conduct divination. They would examine the entrails of sacrificed animals. They would observe the flight of birds. They would read the signs of weather and landscape. And they would deliver their judgment, favorable or unfavorable. This was not merely a religious formality. It directly shaped tactical and strategic decisions. A chieftain who received unfavorable omens from his Druids faced a difficult choice. If he proceeded with the campaign despite the warnings, he risked the demoralization of his warriors. Every man in that army was watching the omens as carefully as the chieftain. Every man knew what the Druids had said. And if the omens said defeat, then every man who went into battle carried in his mind the expectation of defeat, which, in a self-fulfilling way, made defeat more likely. On the other hand, a chieftain who abandoned a campaign because of unfavorable omens might miss a genuine military opportunity, and he might appear weak to rivals who were watching for any sign of indecision. The Druidical oracle was thus embedded in a system of collective belief that made its pronouncements practically significant regardless of their literal truth. Whether or not the entrails of a sacrificed bull actually contained information about the outcome of a battle, the belief that they did was enough to shape the behavior of every person involved. The Gaulish Carnix deserves special mention in any discussion of Druidical warfare. The Carnix was the great war trumpet of the Celtic world, a tall, upright instrument with a bell shaped like the open mouth of an animal, usually a boar or a horse or some fantastical creature. played vertically, projecting its sound above the heads of the warriors and across the battlefield. And the sound it made was unlike any other ancient instrument. Harsh, buzzing, inhuman. A sound designed not to create music, but to create fear. The Carnyx was not simply a signaling instrument used to coordinate troop movements. It was a ritual instrument. Its sound was understood as the voice of the divine world, channeled through the bronze body of the animal-headed bell, sent out across the battlefield to shake the confidence of enemies and to stir the courage of warriors. The specialists who operated the Carnyx were closely associated with the Druidical order, and the combined effect of multiple Carnyxes played simultaneously, together with the war cries of Celtic warriors and the visual spectacle of Latin-decorated armor and weapons, torques and helmets and shields blazing with the intricate curvilinear designs that were the Celtic artistic vocabulary, constituted a deliberate system of psychological warfare. A system in which the Druids were the principal architects. It was sound and spectacle and spiritual authority combined into a single, overwhelming assault on the enemy's confidence. And it worked. The Romans, who were among the most disciplined soldiers in the ancient world, repeatedly recorded their unease in the face of Celtic battlefield display. The sheer volume of sound, the strangeness of the instruments, the wild appearance of the warriors, the unsettling presence of the Druids calling down curses, all of this was designed to break the enemy's nerve before the first blow was struck. But the most famous encounter between Roman soldiers and Druidical practitioners was yet to come. And when it came, it marked the end of an era. We will reach that encounter soon. But first, we need to follow the story of one particular Druid whose life illuminates the collision between the Celtic and Roman worlds more vividly than any general description. Because unlike most Druids, whose names are lost to us, this one left a trail in the Roman historical record. His name was Diviciacus, and his story is one of the most remarkable individual stories from the ancient world. Diviciacus was a Druid of the Aedui. The Aedui were one of the most powerful tribes of Central Gaul. They occupied territory in what is now Burgundy, in east-central France, and they had a long-standing alliance with Rome, an alliance that predated Caesar's campaigns, and that would prove both useful and complicated during the Gallic Wars. Diviciacus first appears in the historical record not in Gaul, but in Rome itself. In approximately 61 before Christ, several years before Caesar's campaigns in Gaul began, Diviciacus traveled to Rome as an ambassador. He came seeking Roman military support for the Aedui against their rivals. The Sequani, a neighboring Gaulish tribe, had allied themselves with the Helvetii and with Germanic tribes from across the Rhine. And the Aedui were losing. Their territory was being encroached upon. Their power was declining. And their Druidical ambassador was sent to the center of the Mediterranean world to plead their case before the Roman Senate. Think about what this means. A Druid, a practitioner of the oral tradition, a man whose knowledge was carried entirely in his memory, a priest of the sacred groves, traveled to Rome. To the city of marble temples and written laws and professional advocates and philosophical schools and all the apparatus of Mediterranean civilization. And he operated there. He spoke before the Senate. He met with Roman intellectuals. And he made an impression, because we know about his visit not just from Caesar's later writings, but from the testimony of Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero, the greatest orator of the Roman world, one of the most brilliant minds of the ancient Mediterranean, a man who spent his life among the most educated people on earth. Cicero met Diviciacus, and he was impressed. In his work, De Divination, a philosophical dialogue about the nature of divination, Cicero mentions Diviciacus by name. He describes him as a man who claimed to know the workings of nature, which the Greeks call physiologia, and who practiced divination partly through augury, the reading of bird signs, and partly through conjecture. The fact that Cicero, of all people, found a Gaulish Druid worth mentioning in a philosophical treatise is itself a remarkable testimony to the intellectual caliber of the man he met. Cicero was not easily impressed. He was surrounded by brilliant people. He had read everything. He had argued with everyone. And he found Diviciacus interesting enough to name him in a work of philosophy. This tells us something that the stereotypes about barbarian Gaul would never suggest. It tells us that there were Druids who could hold their own in conversation with the best minds of the Mediterranean world, who could discuss divination as a shared intellectual interest with a Roman philosopher and be taken seriously, who could operate in a cultural context entirely different from their own and still command respect. Caesar himself knew Divitiacus personally, and in Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars, Divitiacus appears not as a mystical figure or a primitive priest, but as a man of genuine intelligence and political skill, a diplomat, an intelligence officer, a political advisor, a person navigating the most dangerous political landscape of his time with sophistication and courage. The situation Divitiacus navigated was agonizing, because his brother, Dumnorix, was one of the key figures in Gaulish resistance to Roman power. The two brothers stood on opposite sides of the defining conflict of their age, and both of them, in their way, were right. Divitiacus was right that Rome could not be defeated militarily, that the sheer scale and organizational superiority of Roman military power made resistance ultimately futile. Dumnorix was right that accommodation with Rome would lead to the destruction of Gaulish independence and the erasure of the way of life that both brothers had been raised to serve. Caesar's decision to spare Dumnorix's life on multiple occasions, despite Dumnorix's active and repeated opposition to Roman interests, was partly a concession to Divitiacus. Caesar valued the Druid as an ally, as an interpreter, as a source of intelligence about the political dynamics of Gaul. Eventually, that price became too high. Dumnorix was killed during Caesar's second expedition to Britain in 54 before Christ, when he attempted to escape from the Roman camp and flee back to Gaul. And Divitiacus, if he was still alive at that point, would have known that the alliance he had built with Rome had cost him his brother. The story of Divitiacus is the story of the Celtic world in miniature. A sophisticated, intelligent person caught between two great forces, trying to find a way through, making choices that seemed rational at the time, and discovering that the forces in play were too large for any individual to control. Now, Divitiacus is the only Druid known to us by name who appears in Roman historical sources as a genuine political actor. But he was not the last echo of the Druidical tradition in Western culture, because the figure of the Druid survived the destruction of the Druidical order, survived and transformed, Christianized, literary forms that carried the memory of the original into the medieval and modern worlds. The figure of Merlin is perhaps the most famous of these transformations, the wizard of the Arthurian legends, the prophet, the counselor to kings, the master of natural knowledge, the figure who stands between the human world and the supernatural world and mediates between them. The earliest Welsh sources for the Merlin character draw on a tradition of the prophetic poet-wizard that is continuous with the Druidical bard tradition of earlier Celtic culture. The Merlin of the Arthurian tradition, with his knowledge of the natural world, his prophetic powers, his connection to the landscape of Britain, his role as advisor to kings, is essentially a Christianized Druid. A figure who retained the functions and the cultural authority of the Druidical tradition while being embedded in the new Christian cultural framework that replaced Celtic paganism. The transformation was not accidental. When Christianity came to the Celtic world, it did not simply replace what was there. It absorbed it. It took the existing cultural forms, the sacred groves, the holy wells, the prophetic figures, and it baptized them, gave them Christian names and Christian meanings, but preserved their underlying structure. The holy wells that were once sacred to Celtic goddesses became the holy wells of Christian saints. The sacred groves became the sites of Christian churches, and the prophetic druid became the wise wizard of Christian legend. Merlin is what a druid looks like after 1,000 years of Christianity, changed on the surface, recognizable underneath. Now, the archaeological evidence for individual druids is inevitably fragmentary, because the Druids left no written records, and their burial customs are not always easily distinguished from those of other high-status individuals. But certain burials have been tentatively identified as those of Druidical practitioners, based on unusual combinations of objects that suggest a person whose social role crossed the boundaries between the categories that other burials fit neatly into. One such burial was discovered at Colchester in Roman period Britain. The burial contained a set of medical instruments, divination rods, imported Roman wine and food, and locally made objects in the Celtic style. The combination is striking. Medical instruments suggest a healer. Divination rods suggest a practitioner of prophetic arts. The imported Roman goods suggest a person who operated in the Roman world as well as the Celtic one. And the Celtic-style objects suggest a person who maintained their connection to the indigenous tradition even under Roman rule. This is what a Druid looked like in the world of Roman Britain. A person navigating the cultural boundaries of a conquered world, maintaining the old knowledge, incorporating the new, serving a community that now lived under Roman law but still needed the services that only a Druid could provide. It is a portrait of adaptation, of survival in transformed conditions. And it reminds us that the destruction of the Druidical order was not instantaneous. It was gradual, a long process of attrition in which the tradition was squeezed, restricted, driven underground, and slowly suffocated, but not destroyed all at once. Because you cannot destroy something that lives in human memory as easily as you can destroy something that is written on paper or carved in stone. The memory persists. The knowledge finds new forms. The tradition adapts. Until, eventually, it has changed so much that it no longer recognizes itself. And that long, slow transformation is itself a story worth telling. But before we can tell the story of the Druidical tradition's survival and transformation, we have to tell the story of its destruction. And that story begins not with a single dramatic event, but with a policy. A deliberate, sustained, strategic policy implemented by multiple Roman emperors over the course of several decades. The Roman decision to suppress the Druids was not made in a moment of cultural misunderstanding. It was not a military accident. It was not an overreaction by a particular commander who happened to dislike Celtic religion. It was a decision made at the highest levels of the Roman state. Made calmly. Made deliberately. Made with a clear understanding of what the Druids were and why they were dangerous. And it was implemented with the systematic efficiency that made Rome the most effective engine of conquest the ancient world had ever produced. The ancient sources that describe the suppression are not uniformly in agreement about every detail, but they are unanimous on one point. This was a policy decision, not a spontaneous reaction, and the Druids were targeted not because they were strange or exotic or even because their practices were objectionable. They were targeted because they were the organizational center of Celtic resistance to Roman authority. The Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 before Christ to 14 of the Common Era, and who presided over the consolidation of Roman power in Gaul following Caesar's conquest, took the first official steps. Augustus issued decrees restricting Druidical practice, specifically the aspects of Druidical religion that involved what the Romans called human sacrifice. Now, the focus on human sacrifice as the justification for suppression was not accidental. It was strategic. It allowed Rome to frame the persecution of the Druids as a moral crusade rather than as political suppression. Instead of saying, "We are destroying the Druids because they hold Celtic civilization together and their existence makes our control of Gaul more difficult," which was the truth, Rome could say, "We are destroying the Druids because they practice barbaric rituals that civilized people cannot tolerate." Whatever the actual nature and extent of Celtic sacrificial practice, and we discussed the evidence from the bog bodies earlier, the Roman framing ensured that Druidical suppression could be presented as civilizational progress, as the spread of Roman humanitas, as the enlightened elimination of primitive barbarity, rather than what it actually was. The political destruction of an inconvenient intellectual class. The Emperor Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus and reigned from 14 to 37 of the Common Era, went further. He extended the suppression to include the Druidical order as a whole, not just specific practices. The institution itself. The Druids of Gaul found themselves declared illegal. Their assemblies were prohibited. The great annual gathering in the territory of the Carnutes, the institution that had maintained the consistency and coherence of the Druidical tradition across all of Gaul, was banned. Their functions as judges and counselors were transferred to Roman legal institutions. Roman courts replaced Druidical arbitration. Roman law replaced Celtic custom. And the practice of Druidical religion was made a criminal offense for Roman citizens. The effect on the Druidical order in Gaul was severe. But it was not immediate. And it was not complete. Because here is the thing about a tradition maintained through oral transmission and personal apprenticeship. It is harder to suppress than a tradition that depends on buildings and books. You can close a temple. You can burn a library. But you cannot close a human mind. And you cannot burn a memory. The Druids who found their practice banned in Romanized Gaul did not simply cease to exist. Some of them went underground, continuing to practice in secret, continuing to teach the next generation in hidden places. Some of them moved, retreating to territories where Roman control was weaker, to the margins of the empire, to the places where the long arm of Roman law had not yet reached. And the place where many of them went was Britain. Britain in the mid-1st century of the Common Era was a land that Rome had not yet conquered. Caesar had crossed the Channel twice, in 55 and 54 before Christ, but both expeditions were raids rather than conquests. He came, he saw, he went home. Britain remained independent, and for the Druids who were being squeezed out of Gaul, it offered refuge, particularly one place, an island at the far northwestern tip of Wales, separated from the mainland by a narrow strait of water, sacred in the Druidical tradition for reasons that went back centuries. Anglesey. The Romans knew it as Mona, and it became the last stronghold of the Druidical order. Anglesey had been a Druidical center long before the Roman conquest of Gaul made it a refuge. Its location at the far western edge of the known world, surrounded by water that marked the boundary between the human world and the supernatural, gave it a sacred character that the Druidical tradition associated with particularly intense divine presence. Islands were special in the Celtic worldview. They were places set apart, places where the normal rules of the mainland did not entirely apply, places where the boundary between what is and what is beyond was thinner than anywhere else. Anglesey, with its fertile fields, its ancient groves, its proximity to the great mountain landscape of Snowdonia, and its position at the edge of the Celtic world looking out toward the limitless Western Sea, was the perfect embodiment of this sacred geography. And as the Druidical order in Gaul was being systematically destroyed, the Druids who had fled gathered on Anglesey. They brought with them whatever they could carry, which was everything, because everything they had was in their minds. 20 years of education, centuries of accumulated knowledge, the laws and genealogies and histories and astronomical observations and medical lore and theological understanding of an entire civilization. All of it carried in living memory. All of it concentrated now on a small island off the coast of Wales. The last library of the Celtic world, written on no page, stored in no building, existing only in the minds of the men and women who had gathered there to preserve what Rome was trying to destroy. And Rome was coming for them. The destruction of Anglesey is one of the most vivid episodes in the Roman historian Tacitus's account of Britain, and it is one of the most haunting passages in all of ancient historical writing. But that destruction and everything that came after it belongs to what comes next in this story. Because the destruction of Anglesey was not just the burning of groves and the killing of Druids. It was the deliberate extinction of a civilization's memory. It was the moment when thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, carried in living minds, was destroyed in an afternoon. And the echoes of that destruction are still audible today, 2,000 years later. In every question we cannot answer about the Druids, in every gap in the record, in every mystery about their beliefs and practices that the burning of the groves made permanent, we are still living in the silence that Rome created on Anglesey. And in the next part of this story, we will hear the last sounds that broke that silence before it fell. The year was 60 of the Common Era. The governor of Roman Britain was a man named Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, a soldier, a proven commander who had already made his reputation fighting in the mountains of North Africa, a man who understood that the conquest of Britain would not be complete until the last center of organized resistance was destroyed. And that center was Anglesey. Suetonius Paulinus assembled his forces on the mainland shore of the Menai Strait, the narrow channel of water that separates Anglesey from the Welsh mainland. On a calm day, you can see across it easily. The island is right there, close enough to seem reachable, close enough that the Romans on the shore could see what was waiting for them on the other side. And what was waiting for them was something that even Roman discipline found difficult to face. Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes the scene with a vividness that suggests genuine historical memory transmitted through the veterans who were there. On the shore of Anglesey, the defenders had assembled. Celtic warriors stood in dense ranks along the waterline. armed, ready. But among them and between them moved figures that the Roman soldiers had never seen anything quite like. Women in black robes ran between the warriors carrying flaming torches. Their hair was loose and wild. They shrieked and screamed in voices that Tacitus says reminded the soldiers of the Furies, the avenging spirits of Roman mythology. And standing apart from both the warriors and the women were the Druids. They called down curses on the invaders. Their voices carried across the water, pronouncing the condemnation of the divine world upon the Roman army, invoking every sacred power of earth and sky and water against the men who had come to destroy them. And the Roman soldiers froze. These were not recruits. These were experienced legionaries, men who had fought across the empire, men who had faced enemies in every terrain and every condition that the ancient world could offer. And they stood on the shore of the Menai Strait, and they could not move. Tacitus is explicit about this. The soldiers were struck with a kind of paralysis, a superstitious dread that locked their limbs and silenced their discipline. For a moment, perhaps the most remarkable moment in the entire history of the Roman conquest of Britain, the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever produced was stopped dead by the sight of old men raising their hands and women carrying torches. That is the power of belief. That is what the Druids represented. Not military force, not tactical brilliance, but an authority so deep, so rooted in the spiritual landscape of the world these soldiers had entered, that even men who did not share the belief could feel its weight. The moment passed. Roman discipline reasserted itself. The officers shouted their men forward. Shame at being seen to fear what their training told them was mere superstition drove the soldiers into the water. They crossed the strait, some on flat-bottomed boats, the cavalry swimming their horses alongside. And when they reached the other side, they did what Roman soldiers always did. They fought, and they won. The Celtic warriors were overwhelmed. The women with their torches were cut down. And the Druids were killed. Not captured, not enslaved, not sent to Rome to be paraded in a triumph and then quietly pensioned off. Killed. And then the soldiers turned to the groves. The sacred groves of Anglesey. The nematons. The ancient oaks under whose branches generations of Druids had studied and taught and preserved the accumulated knowledge of Celtic civilization. The Romans cut them down and burned them. Tacitus says the groves were devoted to savage rites, that their altars were drenched in the blood of captives, that the divine will was consulted through the examination of human entrails. Whether this was true or whether it was the standard Roman justification for cultural destruction, the propaganda that made conquest seem like a moral obligation rather than what it actually was, we cannot know for certain. What we can know is that the groves were destroyed. The trees that had stood for centuries were felled in hours. The clearings where the oral tradition had been transmitted from one generation to the next were turned to ash and stubble. And the knowledge that those groves had sheltered, the 20-year educations, the astronomical calculations, the legal precedents, the genealogies, the medical lore, the theological understanding that had been accumulated over centuries and carried in living memory, died with the people who carried it. An afternoon's work. That is all it took. A few hours of efficient Roman military violence. And a civilization's intellectual heritage was gone. Not degraded. Not partially damaged. Gone. Because it had never been written down. Because the Druids had made the deliberate choice to keep their knowledge in the most secure archive imaginable, the trained human mind, and that archive, for all its resilience against ordinary threats, was vulnerable to the one thing it could not survive: the death of every person who carried it. This is the tragedy of the Druids. Not that they were destroyed. Many peoples have been destroyed, but that the destruction was so complete, that the knowledge they carried left no trace except in the hostile descriptions of the people who destroyed them. We know the Druids existed. We know they were powerful. We know their learning was vast. We know it took 20 years to acquire. But we do not know what it was. Not really. Not in detail. We have the outlines, the categories, the subjects. But the content, the actual substance of what a fully trained Druid knew, is lost. And it is lost forever. Because the minds that held it were extinguished on Anglesey in 60 of the Common Era, and nothing written on any page could ever reconstruct what those minds contained. Now, the destruction of Anglesey was devastating. But it was not the end of the Druidical tradition everywhere, because there was one significant portion of the Celtic world that Rome never conquered. One place where the legions never marched and the sacred groves were never burned. Ireland. Ireland sat beyond the Western Sea. Roman ships never landed there in force. Roman governors never administered its territories. Roman law never replaced its customs. And in Ireland, the Druidical tradition survived. Changed, yes. Adapted, certainly. But alive. The Irish Druids maintained their functions in Irish society for centuries after the destruction of Anglesey. They continued to serve as judges, as advisors to kings, as keepers of genealogy and law and sacred knowledge. They continued to practice divination and to preside over the ceremonies that marked the turning of the Celtic year. And crucially, they developed something that the continental Druids had never created: a writing system. The Ogham script. Ogham was a system of writing that used arrangements of notches cut along the edge of a stone or a piece of wood. Short lines above, below, or through a central line, each arrangement representing a letter. The system was apparently derived from a system of hand signals, and it developed in Ireland in the early centuries of the Common Era, becoming the primary medium for inscribed text in the Irish Celtic world. The Ogham script was not primarily a literary medium. The Druids did not suddenly abandon their philosophical commitment to oral transmission and start writing down their theology. The texts preserved in Ogham are mostly memorial inscriptions, names and genealogies carved on standing stones, markers of identity and lineage and territorial claim. But the existence of Ogham tells us something important. The Irish Druids were adapting. They were finding ways to preserve certain kinds of information in durable form without abandoning the principle that sacred knowledge belonged in the mind rather than on a surface. The boundary between what could be written and what must be remembered was being renegotiated. And the negotiation was being conducted by practitioners who understood both the value and the vulnerability of purely oral tradition. They had seen, through the networks of communication that connected the Celtic world, what had happened when the Romans reached Anglesey. They knew that minds could be destroyed, and they were beginning, cautiously, selectively, to create backup copies of at least some of what they knew. But the greatest transformation of the Irish Druidical tradition came not from Rome, but from Christianity. Christianity reached Ireland in the 5th century of the Common Era. The traditional date is 432, the year associated with the mission of St. Patrick. And the encounter between Christianity and the Druidical tradition in Ireland was unlike anything that had happened on the continent. Because in Ireland, there was no Roman conquest to clear the ground before the missionaries arrived. Christianity came to Ireland without legions, without military suppression of the existing religious establishment, without the infrastructure of Roman imperial power to enforce conversion. It came through persuasion, through the personal authority of individual missionaries, through the gradual accumulation of converts who found something in the Christian message that spoke to needs the Druidical tradition had not fully addressed. And because it came this way, the transition was different. The Irish monks who built the great monasteries of the early Christian period were not working in a cultural vacuum. They were working in a world shaped by centuries of Druidical practice. They inherited the Druidical reverence for learning, the Druidical commitment to the preservation and transmission of knowledge, the Druidical understanding that genuine wisdom required years of dedicated study under the guidance of a master. And they carried these values into the new Christian institutions. The great Irish monasteries, Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Iona, became centers of learning that were continuous in spirit, if not in content, with the Druidical tradition that preceded them. The monks who labored over illuminated manuscripts in the scriptoria of these monasteries were doing something that the Druids had never done. They were writing things down. But the reverence with which they approached the act of preserving knowledge, the years of training they underwent, the extraordinary artistic skill they brought to the decoration of their manuscripts. All of this speaks to a culture that understood knowledge as sacred, that understood the preservation of knowledge as a holy act, that understood the relationship between the knower and the known as something that required not just intelligence, but devotion. These are Druidical values, transformed by Christianity, but recognizable. And the monks who preserved them were, in a sense that they might not have acknowledged, the heirs of the Druids. It was these Irish monks who preserved much of what we know about the pre-Christian Celtic world. The early Irish legal texts, the Brehon Laws, which were committed to writing in the early medieval period, preserve a legal tradition that is continuous with the Druidical judicial practice we described earlier. The Irish mythological texts, the great cycles of stories about gods and heroes, preserve fragments of the theological and cosmological understanding that the Druids had maintained through oral tradition. The genealogies and king lists that the monks carefully recorded preserve the historical memory that the Druidical bards had once maintained through composed verse. None of this is a perfect preservation of the original. The monks who wrote these texts down were Christians. They edited. They reinterpreted. They Christianized. They removed or softened elements that conflicted with their faith. But they preserved enough that we can see through the Christian surface to the older layer beneath. And what we see there is the shadow of the Druidical world. Distorted, incomplete, but recognizable. And that shadow is all we have. Now, the Celtic festivals that the Druids had presided over survived the transition to Christianity in forms that are still with us today. Samhain became All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. The Christian Church placed its Feast of the Dead at exactly the moment in the year when the Celtic tradition said the dead walked among the living. This was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate strategy of cultural absorption. Take the existing festival. Give it a Christian meaning. Let the old practices continue under new names. Imbolc, the February festival associated with the goddess Bridget and the first stirrings of spring, became the Feast of Saint Bridget. The goddess became a saint. The sacred flame that had been tended in the goddess's honor was maintained at the monastery of Kildare, tended now by nuns rather than priestesses, but burning still. The same fire. The same place. A different name. Beltane, the May festival of fertility and fire, survived in folk customs across the Celtic world. May Day celebrations, maypoles, bonfires, the driving of cattle between fires for purification. All of these are echoes of the Druidical Beltane, reaching forward through time into a world that has largely forgotten their origin. And Lugnasad, the August harvest festival, survived as various harvest fairs and festivals across Ireland and Scotland. The Puck Fair in Killorglin, County Kerry, one of Ireland's oldest fairs, is believed to have roots that reach back to Lugnasad celebrations. The cycle continues. The wheel of the year still turns. And the festivals that the Druids marked are still marked, though the people who celebrate them may not know whose hands first lit the fires. The Druidical understanding of the landscape as sacred also survived. Across Ireland and Britain, the holy wells, the sacred springs, the ancient trees, the hilltops where the veil between worlds was thin, continued to be visited and venerated. Christianity renamed them, rededicated them, but did not abandon them. Because the people who lived in these landscapes knew that certain places were special, they had always known, and no change of religion could entirely erase that knowledge. The holy wells of Ireland, numbering in the thousands, are the most visible surviving legacy of this tradition. Many of them are still visited today. People still leave offerings. Coins, ribbons, small personal objects. They tie cloth to the branches of trees near the wells, a practice called a clúdi well tradition, believing that as the cloth rots, the illness or the trouble it represents will fade away. This is not Christianity. This is something older, something that Christianity absorbed but never fully replaced. And when a person in the 21st century ties a ribbon to a tree beside a holy well in the west of Ireland and makes a wish or says a prayer, they are participating, whether they know it or not, in a practice whose roots reach back through the Christian centuries, through the early medieval period, through the age of the Irish Druids, and into the deep past of Celtic sacred tradition. 2,000 years. At least. Possibly much more. The thread is that long, and it has not broken. So what do we make of the Druids, now that we have followed their story from the sacred groves of pre-Roman Gaul to the burning of Anglesey and the slow transformation of their tradition in Christian Ireland? What do we take away from a story about people who left no writings, no buildings, no monuments, and whose knowledge was so completely destroyed that we cannot reconstruct more than a fraction of what they knew? Perhaps we take away a warning. The Druids made a choice about how to preserve knowledge. They chose the human mind. They chose living memory over dead text. And for centuries, that choice served them well. Their tradition was consistent across thousands of miles. Their knowledge was secure against theft and seizure. Their understanding was deep in a way that merely written knowledge cannot be, because it had been internalized through years of practice rather than simply recorded on a surface. But the choice had a cost. When the minds were destroyed, the knowledge was destroyed with them. Completely. Irreversibly. In a way that would not have happened if the knowledge had also been written down. We will never know what the Druids knew. Not really. We will never recover the content of those 20-year educations. The astronomical calculations. The philosophical arguments. The legal precedents. The medical formulas. The theological understanding that took a lifetime to acquire. All of it is gone. And the silence where that knowledge used to be is one of the great empty spaces in the history of human thought. But perhaps we also take away something else. Something more hopeful. Because the Druids may be gone, but the world they tried to understand is still here. The oak trees still grow. The springs still rise. The stars still move in the patterns that the Druids tracked with such care. The wheel of the year still turns through Samhain and Imbolc and Beltane and Lughnasadh. The natural world that the Druids read as a sacred text is still there, still saying whatever it was saying to the people who spent 20 years learning to listen. We have lost the interpreters, but we have not lost the text. And in a time when the relationship between human beings and the natural world has never been more strained, when the consequences of treating nature as a resource to be exploited rather than a community of beings to be understood are becoming catastrophically apparent, the Druidical insight that genuine knowledge of the natural world requires sustained, attentive, humble presence within it may be more relevant now than it has been at any time since the groves on Anglesey burned. The Druids knew something we have forgotten, that the forest is not a backdrop, it is a teacher, that the spring is not a water source, it is a voice, that the sky is not a ceiling, it is a book, and that reading these things requires not instruments and measurements and data, though those have their place, but time, patience, attention, the willingness to sit in a grove for 20 years and learn what the oak has to say. We are not going to do that. Our world is not built for that kind of patience. But knowing that someone once did, knowing that an entire civilization organized itself around the principle that the deepest knowledge comes from the deepest attention, knowing that for 1,000 years the most powerful intellectual class in Europe was made up of people who believed that the natural world was worth a lifetime of listening, that knowledge is worth something. It is worth remembering. Even if the people who first understood it are gone, even if the groves are burned, even if the silence they left behind can never be fully broken. The Druids are gone, but the oaks are still standing, and they are still waiting for someone to listen.